Please introduce yourself and describe your role in this case.
Hello, my name is Lee Merritt. I'm a civil rights attorney that has been retained by the family of Marvin Scott III, a 26-year-old McKinney man who was suffering from a mental health crisis on March 14th of 2021 when he was accosted by law enforcement, criminalized for his mental health condition, and taken into custody where he later died after being restrained by 7 police officers.
Why did you decide to take on this case?
This case represents an instance of police brutality, in our opinion. This falls in line with the cases that my office specializes in. We deal with a lot of high volume and high profile officer involved shootings and in custody deaths. We believe that all American citizens have a right to protection, to certain due process, even when they're accused of a crime. Particularly so when they're accused of a crime like possessing a single joint, as it was the case with Marvin Scott. And we believe that more needs to be done to protect some of our most vulnerable population, those suffering from a disability.
What sets it apart from so many others that you represent?
Marvin Scott's case is unique. For me, it hits home because it happened in the city where I live and the place where I pay taxes. And I know that in part his death was sponsored by my taxes.
What are the main arguments and concerns against the officer's behavior the day of Marvin's arrest?
I have several concerns about Marvin's arrest. It would start, of course, at the reason for the police encounter in the first place. I don't think people should be criminalized for possession of user amounts of marijuana. Marvin Scott often used marijuana to treat his diagnosed schizophrenic condition because the meds offered didn't react well in his system, and he found that marijuana smoothed him out for a bit. If this was a concern at all, it was a mental health concern. It should be treated similar to the opioid crisis in predominantly white neighborhoods, and Marvin should have been taken for help. Instead, he was criminalized, taken into custody, and we don't know exactly what happened behind the walls. We do know that whatever happened, the Collin County Sheriff thought that his correctional officers violated their own code, and as a result, 7 of the officers were terminated.
Have we seen some of the elements in Marvin's story play out elsewhere?
We've seen a spike in officer-involved brutality, officer misconduct, directed particularly at people suffering from mental health crisis. Because people suffering from mental health crisis have a difficulty complying or responding, as officers are trained that citizens must reply to their lawful commands. They often escalate quickly into encounters that far too often turn deadly. We saw this happen in George Floyd's case, not necessarily a mental health component, but an officer who caused George Floyd to die from asphyxiation because of his alleged failure to comply. In this case, Marvin Scott was, according to the sheriff's statement, restrained by 7 officers. He was held down. He was maced. A spit hook was placed over his head, very similar to what happened to Daniel Prude in New York before he became unresponsive. What we will see, and what we anticipate seeing playing out in this case, is a battle over the causation of death. We saw this play out in the Derek Chauvin trial, where medical experts came to testify about various causes of death for George Floyd. The forensic experts that we hired in this case and the medical examiner for Collin County are going to have to explain to Marvin's family, to the public, and likely before a jury one day, what were the factors that contributed to his death. And the thoroughness of that medical examiner report and some prevailing myths in the area of in custody deaths will tend to manifest things like excited delirium or drug overdose or pre-existing conditions are often blamed for mysterious death at the hands of state-sanctioned or state-sponsored officials. And so I expect that will also be a factor in this case. However, it seems clear to me that 26-year-old Marvin Scott, who had no real significant physical health problems, his death was caused by asphyxiation as a result of the men who assaulted him while in custody.
Does Texas have a particular history with such cases?
Governor Abbott, the governor of Texas, just announced during his State of the State that Texas was suffering from a mental health crisis. There's been a spike in the number of mental health incidences, and unfortunately, Texas hasn't provided the mental health resource officers or mental health professionals to respond to it. When people are in mental health crisis in Texas, one of the few people available to respond to their crisis are police officers. And police officers are simply not trained to deal with men and women in crisis. In the case of so many people, like Patrick Warren Sr., who was killed on his front lawn, Damian Daniels, a Iraq War veteran who was killed on his front lawn while suffering from a mental health crisis, Pamela Turner, who was killed at her apartment complex, Darius Tarver, a UNT student who was killed at his apartment complex. When people called for help, and instead they received an overly militarized police force who knew only to use force to force compliance.
What did you think of the officers being fired, and what's this about?
We think that any time someone causes the death of another human being, whether they're on the job or they're not, that they should be held criminally accountable. The administrative process is important. The fact that these officers were fired sends a clear signal that what they did, the use of force that they applied, was not justified, which is a defense to the use of force or criminal homicide. But before we get to the defense, or before we get to the administrative decision, there must be criminal accountability if we're ever going to see these kinds of things stop happening or at least be reduced.